I'm going to talk now about something very particular in medical writing. A lot of the ideas are based on 3 or 4 papers that have been written by journal editors, and in particular from the British Journal of Surgery. I'll cite this person as I come along. Whatever type of study, whatever type of publication you're looking at, it's very important to realize that how you say something, how you write it, the style that you give to it, will give you the print out of what you're trying to say. The way you talk is something very important. You are listening to me. The way I'm going to talk might influence what you think. It's the same thing for medical writing. You write something, you're a writer, and you want to talk to an audience. The way that audience interprets what you say depends on how you write it. And that's what medical style is about. Can I have this video?
What did you do to my sign?
I wrote the same, but in different words.
Excellent.
So you see, what you say and how you say it influences how people interpret. So, once again, let's go through what medical writing is. It's a very special form of communication. You've heard the types, but we are out to relate facts, sometimes with not a high level of evidence, but we want them to be interpreted objectively, without any shading about the author's feelings or the way he thinks the information or the facts should be related. He's gone to a lot of trouble. He's very proud of what he's done. But that should not influence the wording and how you interpret. The goal of medical writing is to get a message across to the audience, the readership. Don't forget that. That's essential. You have one message, essentially one message, that you want the readership to retain. Don't forget that the readership is not necessarily somebody who knows the same things that you know. And that's essential. As a medical writer, you have to write to an audience that is probably not as expert as you, or at least not as expert as you in that particular field, or that particular topic, or doesn't have the same opinion. And you want to convince him. That's what the medical style is going to help you do. And most importantly, medical style means that you're going to be able to transmit a message without any ambiguity. The reader should be able to interpret what you have to say without thinking, does he mean that? Or does he mean that? Or does he mean something else? I'll go into detail about that. There is a duality between you as a writer and you as a reader that we have to think about every time we write a paper. And it's all about the style, the way that we do it. Now, I like to compare medical writing to a goldfish. This goldfish is the facts, the data. Depends on the precision with which you have performed your study, the methodology that you've used, giving it the robustest. This will give us authenticity and credibility. Now that goldfish, once it's colored with all these qualities, these characteristics, we're going to put it into a container, to a glass bowl. And that glass bowl is the structure of your paper. It is also the water and the glass are the style. In other words, what we want to do is to be able to see that goldfish. We want to be able to see that data. We don't want the structure or the style to influence how we see or do not see well the goldfish. I'm going to go through, as I said, several principles. In medical writing, there are 3 principles to increase the comprehension without ambiguity. That is brevity or concision, being short, but also being clear, but most essentially being precise. And these 3 are related. Why be short? There are many limitations. The journal has limitations in space, or the website even. You have limitations because you can just absorb so much information and not much more. And you don't have the time. We're all in clinical practice. We have other things to do. We want to be able to get the information quickly. We want to get it quickly and understand the essential point directly. Clarity means that you are clear in the way you express yourself, the language. Because if you are not clear, the reader will not understand what you're talking about, or he might, even worse, misinterpret what you're saying. You don't want the reader to misinterpret what you say. That means we have to have a style which is simple, clear, very simple in the fact that we don't use any poetic, any impressionistic terms. We want to make sure that the reader understands it right from the start. Last but not least, and certainly most importantly, is that we have to have precision in the way we write. We don't want to paraphrase. We don't want words like some, a few, many, most. We want to have numbers. We want to know exactly what we're talking about. I'll go through this again and again. We want to avoid things like this. Most patients. What's most? 51%? 99%? In the scientific world that we live in and we work in, it's very important. There's a big difference between 51% and 99%, but both can be expressed by the word most. Second of all, if this 51%, what's happening to the other 49%? Medical writing has to account for 100% of the population that you're talking about. When there's a conflict between these 3 characteristics, precision should override. Be precise. This will lead to being clear, and then you can work on the brevity. Now I'm going to talk a little bit about verbs. Verbs, everybody knows what a verb is? Sure. In medical writing, a verb tells the time, or sets the pace, or provides the purpose of your paper. And most important, going back to what we just heard from Professor Boney, is going to indicate the level of evidence, or even better, the level of causality. Verbs reflect the timing of an action in relation to what you're reporting, what you're writing. And this is why we use only 4 verb tenses. The present tense indicates an action that's currently occurring. Show is shown. It has a very specific meaning in medical writing. I'll talk about that. The simple past tense indicates an action that has already occurred before the present moment where you're writing. And usually now it's finished. Showed, were shown. Sorry about the error there. On my computer it works well. When it's transmitted, it doesn't. There's another tense, which is the present perfect tense, that indicates that an action has already taken place in the past, but the results are still relevant. And that's using the composite term with the verb have shown, has shown, or has been shown in the passive voice. This is a representation of those actions being in the past or in the present. When you want to relate a fact that has taken place in the past, but you want to have a relationship between what has taken place and what is still going on, you can use both of these tenses in the same sentence. For instance, patients who had elected the past perfect to undergo surgery completed the questionnaires, simple past. Here's an example from the literature. In the same sentence. Past perfect, have compared, simple past, underwent. We have a relationship in the time that has been expressed by the use of these 2 different verb tenses. The progressive tense is something we use when we speak. It should not be used in the medical literature when we write. It leads to misuse, as you can see in this example. The future is extremely rare. There are examples. As you see in this, we suggest ways could be improved. We are looking into the future. We will report erroneous conclusions. This is misuse of the future tense. It should not be in the medical literature. We have a specific structure in the way we talk, in the way we write. I'm going to deal with that later. It's called IMRAD, Introduction, Material and Methods, Results, and Discussion. It's an acronym that stands for those 5 topics. And the verb tense is related to that structure. We use essentially the present and the past, and very, very rarely these other tenses. In the title, we can use the present tense if you use a verb. But that present tense in the title, has a very specific meaning, and it's very strong. Using a verb in a title in the present tense means that you are implying causality. You're saying something very strong. Causality, as Professor Boni pointed out, is something that's very important to think about. When you have a controlled randomized trial, or any sort of trial, any sort of comparison, you use statistical tests to come up with a p-value or a confidence interval. I'll go into that a little bit in detail later on. But this is just a comparison. A randomized controlled trial is the only way we have today to eliminate bias in the way we come to a conclusion. Why is that? You have propensity scores, you have multivariate analysis. All these methods have been devised to try to eliminate biases by eliminating what? Confounding factors. A randomized controlled trial is unique because it eliminates biases, it eliminates confounding factors that you know about, but also those you do not know about. And a propensity score, multivariate analysis, will only eliminate the biases or the confounding factors that you put into it. Garbage in, garbage out. A randomized controlled trial eliminates that. So, once again, if you use the present tense in the title, it should be a randomized controlled trial, unbiased. It's a strong statement. In the summary, you can use the present tense essentially for the conclusion, but most of what you have already done is in the past tense. Introduction as well, we'll look at that in detail. You can use the present tense, the past tense, sometimes the past perfect. Material and methods, only the past. Everything has been done. No present, no future. Results, same thing. You've done your study, you have your results. Everything is in the past tense. Then you discuss. Here you can use the present tense, the past tense. We'll see the details. Sometimes the past perfect, as we just heard. The conclusion is the only place where you might use the future if there is something that implies that you have to go further and take advantage of what you've found and conclude that in the future, your results will influence something that might be done. Verbs can be descriptive or declarative. And they should correspond to the types of studies that we've just heard from Professor Boni. When you have a descriptive study, you're describing characteristics. When you have an analytic study, you're analyzing something. You're doing usually with statistical tests. You want to determine if there's a relationship between various factors. For a descriptive study, you should use descriptive verbs. For an analytic study, you can use descriptive verbs, but essentially, you're going to use what we call declarative verbs. Because verbs have three functions in medical writing, very specifically in medical writing. Either you want to use the verb to compare, to show that you compared things, or you want to do what we call theorizing, or last, describing things, descriptive, just defining facts. Now, when you want to compare, what are you doing? You want to relate or indicate what you think, the facts that you're relating, how they relate to what you are doing. You want to compare one work in relation to another. And you want to do that with an author that you're citing, for instance. Now, you can do this in a descriptive way, saying our findings are in accordance with, or our findings contrast or differ from, or just simply saying that we found. This is just descriptive. However, if you want to imply that there might be causality, then you have to use a declarative verb. And those declarative verbs are strong verbs. It's show. Our findings showed. When we show something, we've demonstrated it. We've proven it. This is the declarative verb. And it should not be used for something that's just a description. I hope I can make that clear, that there has to be a distinction between what you find so that you can describe it, and what you prove, what you show, essentially by a randomized controlled trial. There are many words that imply comparisons, but they don't give the result of whether it's descriptive or analytic. Whatever you use, the comparison has to be obvious. The second function is theorizing. Now, this is an indication that you use about an argument, about a work, but you're not sure of its relationship to what you're trying to compare. You're not sure of any possible causality. And we use what we call hedging verbs or modal verbs. May, seems, appears, suggests, could support. You're not sure, so you have a modifier that implies that you're not sure. This is good writing. This is what you're supposed to be doing. They're called modal, as I said, or speculative or hedging verbs. They can be used for emerging but not proven statements yet, and probably lead the way to experimental studies that are going to be someday in a randomized controlled trial and will be able to prove or get your working hypothesis into validation. And you see, for the first time, we cited Richard Horton. Richard Horton was that editor-in-chief of the British Medical Journal that I'm so proud of, because this is the person that taught me, essentially, what medical writing is about. Here's some examples. Here's some examples of modal or speculative verbs that lead you to understand that we don't have the proof yet. We're not in a declarative mode. We're in a descriptive and sort of a hypothetical mode. The third is a straightforward description that we find. I don't have to elaborate on that. My point is that the strength of the verbs is important and should correspond to the level of evidence, or even better, causality. We want to make a distinction between a simple association and causality. Association is very frequent. We have the situations where a phenomena occurs more often than another than would be expected. You can even have a p-value to show that it's different. But it doesn't mean that it is A is due to B. There's a difference, and that's all you can say. You found the difference. You can describe the difference. You can analyze it, but only if it's a randomized controlled trial or the result of a randomized controlled trial can you say that A is due to B. without any confounding factors. Now, look at this title. This is absolutely fantastic. This came out of JAMA just recently, March. It gives the theme. Your title is there. It's an association. It's not proof of any causality. And the design setting, the outcome measures, prove that it is just an association. There is no randomized controlled trial here. This is just an epidemiology study. We can't come to any conclusion, as you've heard before, in anything except for randomized controlled trials. This is very important when you write a paper. If you're not writing a paper about a case report, a case series, a cohort study, a case control study, you cannot come to a generalization. You cannot come to a conclusion. We'll go into this again and again. Once again, the strength of verbs is important, and you have to make a distinction between what you use as a verb in a descriptive manner or in a declarative manner. Busy slide, but it does give you, I want you to look at the examples. We can describe something is associated with, or we found, we identified. But when you want to say something is been proven, you should use verbs like show, demonstrate, prove, establish, cause, determine, or results in. This is very important. When you use the present tense, it is for general knowledge. It's something that's admitted by everybody or universally accepted. And that is the only time you use the present tense. You don't even need a reference for it very often. However, when you use the present tense in a title, as I said before, it's declarative. It should correspond to a randomized controlled trial. Just summarizing. Several prospective studies have shown this is strong, but promising results means something has gone wrong in the way you've said this. You cannot show promising results. You have to show results. Anyhow, this author demonstrated a clear survival advantage. That means, that implies that he did a controlled randomized trial. And we see that it's a prospective randomized controlled trial, so this is okay. Take a look at this title. Minimal invasive pancreatoduodenectomy does not improve. When you read that, what's your impression? This guy has shown something. He should have shown something. Now, don't look at the names. I'm not being mean to these people. But this was a database. A database doesn't show anything. It just gives you information, and you can find that information. So if you use the verb show, that means you have demonstrated something. If not, do not use the present tense in a title. It's too strong. Here's another example. This author says it has been proven that complete mesocholic excision results in a higher lymph node. It has been proven. But when you look at all the papers that have been published, none of them are randomized controlled trials. These are just observational studies. I don't want to be mean, but you can't say that this has been proven. Or you can say that it was found. Okay? So the strength of verbs is something that you should never forget. Here's another example. This is strong. You can read that title and you'll say, well, I'm never going to use fibrin glue. I don't need it. It doesn't prove any. It doesn't work. However, you have to look and critically appraise where this is coming from. And in the paper, you can see that it's not all that strong. So be very careful of the words you use and how you use them. Another important aspect of medical writing is the active versus the passive voice. Prefer the active voice, if possible. Try to avoid the passive voice. But it leads to another problem, and that is that if we use the active voice, we have to use personal pronouns. Our IRV. We concluded. Now, some journals do not like the first person. Others will accept it. I think I have a slide saying those that do and those that do not. But let's go through that. You can always transform the passive voice into the active voice. But it does sometimes lead to another problem. Can the omentum actually do something? Cover the stomach by himself? Well, I think we're adults and we understand the difference between those two things. This certainly can be transformed into the active voice and be much better. The medical style is absolutely realistic here. I think that most journals will accept the first person. I prefer to write in the first person when I can. I don't know if surgical endoscopy has a specific instructions for authors on that. I see that it's possible. And I think it leads to shorter sentences. I do know that the World Journal of Surgery and the British Journal of Surgery do not like the first person, and they will criticize it sometimes. Clear writing makes your text readable. Clear means you want to be short, and that's the concision and brevity that I was talking to you about. You want to prefer shorter words and shorter sentences. Shorter words and shorter sentences. You might want to vary the length of a sentence to make sure that the reader does not get bored. But I think more importantly than just trying to say, well, a sentence should not be more than 10 or 12 words or 2 lines, is what we call the breath test. In other words, if you can read a sentence without running out of breath, it's okay. If you have run out of breath, that sentence is too long. You want to avoid what we call verbosity. It may seem reasonable to assume that. These are useless words. You have to get rid of that. That's not good medical writing. That's not good medical style. Very simply, here's the version getting rid of what we call verbosity. You want to avoid double negatives. We use that in our spoken language very often. It's elegant, it's poetic, but this does not make for good medical writing. Complications were not uncommon, were rare. Hemostatics were not unnecessary, they were necessary. You want to avoid verbs that are ambiguous, words that or phrases that are ambiguous, if necessary. You want to give this patient hemostatics, if necessary. Well, if you don't describe when it is necessary, this is ambiguous. You don't know. What if it's not necessary? You're leading the reader into a position where he doesn't really understand the situation or the patient population that you're talking about. So avoid terms like if necessary, if required. but explained it. When you write, you want to avoid emotions. Unfortunately. Okay. Unfortunately. Fortunately, there's no place for those words in medical writing. These are personal opinions, and they influence the reader. You don't want to do that. That's not good medical writing. Only, look at the last example. There were no differences in operative time between the two groups, and the rate of conversion to open from laparoscopic surgery was only 5.4%. Why only? It could be 3%, it could be 6%. Would you still use the word only? These are useless words, and they influence the reader. You want to avoid what we call abstract nouns that always can be replaced by a verb. The addition of, you can use the verb add. Formation of, you can use the verb form. Inside every abstract noun, there's a verb struggling to get out. You want to avoid what we call frustrated verbs. In other words, nouns that have been made from verbs, or verbs that have been made from nouns, sorry. They made a comparison between the two methods and found no difference in sensitivity. Why make a comparison? Just say they compared. I'm sorry, it's out of order. The authors made the conclusion. No, let's just say the authors concluded. Being clear also means being logical and chronological. Now I'm going to talk about 7 specific words that have specific meanings. And if I talk about them, because everybody uses the word and doesn't really realize that it has a specific meaning. These 7 words should be used for very specific meanings. When you use the word significant in medical writing, it should only relate to statistical significance. Do not use the word significant to say something that's substantial, that's important. It has a connotation in medical writing, and it should only be used for statistical significance. And to avoid any confusion, even though it may be a little bit longer, when you use the word significant, you should say statistically significant. No ambiguity. The same thing with the word correlate. Correlation is a statistical test. If you use the verb correlate, it should only be for that statistical test. Don't use the word correlate for anything else. Duration is related to time. Length is related to how you measure something. Now, of course, you can measure time. But this is Mike Saar that you've heard about that has always corrected me when I write a paper, and I think it's important. We talk about duration of hospital stay, duration of an operation, not the length of hospital stay or the length of an operation. Semantics. Agreement. When you agree with somebody, that's okay. But if you use the word agreement, there is a statistical test of agreement. It's a kappa statistic. Be very careful how you use the word agreement. Equivalent. Now, I'm going to talk about this when I talk about statistics later on. Be very careful when you use the word equivalent. Equivalent has a very specific meaning. And it's not because you've not found a statistical significance that you can say that something is, the two studies that you're talking about, the two groups that you're talking about are equivalent, or the results are equivalent. Be very careful about that. I'll talk about that in a little while. The word predictive. The word predictive should be used only for multivariate analysis, when you've used that test, whatever it is, to find a predictive factor or a prognostic factor. Last but not least, the word trend has a statistically significant meaning. It's when that p-value is between 0.05 and 0.10. It's not statistically significant, but it almost is. We talk about a trend. Now, when you talk about significant, I'm going to give you some examples. Here we see the significant increased time. This is very ambiguous. Significant, does it mean that it's substantial, that it's important, or does it mean it's statistically significant? To avoid that ambiguity, you should say statistically significant or avoid the word significant. Okay? Am I getting that message across? Do not use the word significant other than for statistical significance. And to avoid any ambiguity, put the word statistically significant. Here we see it. This is good. I'll go a little bit further with some other semantics later. Was related directly. What does that mean? Is that statistically significant or not? Okay, the author gets around it. He's giving you a p-value here. Again, we see significant interaction. P-value. More, significantly more common, but no p-value. This is not good. We don't know what they're talking about. We don't know if that significance is statistically significant or not. Worse, equivalent, and similar. What he's trying to say here, everybody understands, but I hope. Does everybody understand? No, maybe not. He's trying to say that there's no statistically significant difference here. So he says, if there is not, then this is similar. But what is he talking about? He's talking about 10% and 14%. Can you really say that's similar? No, it's not correct. The word is not correct. And can you go forward? For some reason, I can't move forward. Okay. When you do not find a statistically significant difference, it does not mean that it's equivalent or similar. It just means that you were unable to find any statistically significant difference. It's not a real difference. It's not a difference. Difference is not written on your forehead. A statistical difference means you've done a test, a very specific test, and you found a p-value, or you found a confidence interval. That's all it means. It's not nothing that's it's not a characteristic in itself. So you can't say that if you don't find a p-value that's statistically significant, that the two groups that you're comparing are similar or equivalent. And this is a very famous citation. Absence of evidence is not evidence of absence. It just means that you were unable to find any statistical significance. That's all. These are correct ways of speaking. Okay, I'm going to go a little quick on this, so I'm running over time. When you talk about your results, this is how you should state it. And you should avoid generalizations because you found that A is better than B, saying that this is the way it should be for everybody. And this is part of the medical style. Medical style means also that you're very complete and that you list, you categorize, you itemize all the characteristics that you want to elaborate in the same chronological order in the introduction, in material and methods, in results, and in your discussion. Don't go from what you did first to what you did second. Keep that same chronological order, because in the spirit of what you're saying, the reader is going to might misinterpret what you're talking about, what you're relating to. Keep all items in the same chronological order. Just an example here. You see listed here on the second line, age, race, sex, ASA, class, functional status, and comorbidities. Table 5. This is the order. But when you go to table 5, the order is not the same. This might be confusing for a reader who's in a hurry. So use the same order all the time. Can you take that off? Thank you. Here's another example where elap was used before ape here, and then ape was used before elap here. If we do a comparison like you see here in the results, fortunately, the author has said ape before elap, but if he didn't say that, you might not know whether 15% was related to ape or to elap. So be very careful about that. Same order, same chronology, all throughout your text. There are a lot of words that lead to ambiguity. I've listed some here. Avoid them. Frequent, common, uncommon, rare. You don't know what they mean, really. In France, we conducted a study. We asked residents, we asked chief residents, we asked professors, full professors, chief of departments, what they meant by words like frequent, common. They were asked to give a percentage related to frequent or rare. Can you imagine that the word always got rated 99% or 98%, not 100%? So that means that when we talk about things, we don't give them the same meaning. So be very careful. I talked about precision. Don't use the word frequent. You say 50%. You say 80%. You say 100%. Another ambiguous term, some other ambiguous words are this, these, and by. Be very careful how you use these words. When you use this and these as a first word of a sentence relating to something that has preceded, it can be ambiguous. Always use this and these with the topic that it's related to. This topic is what I'm talking about. These people are what I'm talking about, not just these or this. And in by as well. Here's an example of the misuse or use of this and these. Let me talk just a little bit about the words by and, especially in titles. Look at this title. Options and limitations. We'll talk about the and later. In applying the fistula classification by the International Study Group for Pancreatic Fistula. Who applies? Was that classification by the international study group? Or is it the options that are by? I'm exaggerating, of course. But I just want to give you a view of how these words can be misinterpreted. Don't forget, I don't know how many of you have English as your mother tongue here. If it's not, you might ask the question, what does that by stand for? Or at least subconsciously. This is not good medical writing. You have to be very clear, precise, and unambiguous. Take this example. We're going to look at the word "and" now. Gastric perforation during endoscopic resection for gastric carcinoma and the risk of peritoneal dissemination. What does the "and" relate to? Is it the gastric perforation that leads to the risk? Is it the endoscopic resection that leads to that risk? Or is it because of gastric carcinoma? There's subconsciously, we have an ambiguous interpretation of that title. So avoid by, avoid and. Something very important in a title that I'm going to talk about later on is the position you give to what we call the strong words, the first words. As it reads here, it certainly, the author should, or at least I would interpret, that is the gastric perforation that leads to the risk of peritoneal dissemination. The strong word is gastric perforation. It's the first word. This gives the sense, the meaning to the title. It could be written this way. No and. We understand that the peritoneal dissemination comes from the gastric perforation. And can be used for plus or in addition to, as you see in this title. I don't think there's much confusion possible here. But be very careful when you use it here. Again, an example. Difficult to understand. Another very important fact in medical writing, in the medical style, is to always use the same words. Here we see two words that mean probably the same thing, but they don't really mean the same thing. Readmittance, you could be admitted but not be re-hospitalized. So be very careful if you say, obviously this author is talking about the same thing, but he's used two words that have slightly different meanings. Avoid this. Always use, do not be afraid to use exactly the same word to say the same thing. Very vague terms that should be avoided in a title, just listing them there. Avoid articles in titles as much as possible. They're not necessary. Try to find a way at least of avoiding them. Something very important in medical style is what we call denominator statements. Do not use what we call numerator statements, just a number. A number should be, as you've heard before, related to what we call a prevalence, a snapshot of what's going on, how many cases for a population, or an incidence, how many cases arrive in a time period. And don't make the mistake that everybody makes, most everybody makes, between prevalence and incidence. They are two different things. They're related, but they're two different things and they have different meanings. Don't use those two words interchangeably. A prevalence is a snapshot of one moment. An incidence is related to the number of new cases per time period or per population, whatever. So use denominator statements. Don't use numerator statements. Do not use techniques in your medical style that make things appear more credible. For instance, percentages. Percentages, when the denominator is less than 50, give an impression that might be false. I'm going to talk about standard deviations later on. Look at this. In this pilot study, we found that the CVS, the critical view of safety, was obtained by only 20% of participation surgeons. Okay, great. How many surgeons were we talking about? 10. 10, okay? So that means we're talking about 2 patients, 20% of 10. Very impressive, at 20%. But you have to know what the denominator is. So do not use percentages when the denominator is less than 50. Just a rule. Make you laugh a little bit. The drug cured 1/3 of the infected mice. Another 1/3 were not affected, and third mice got away. Percentage signs should be used carefully and repeated as necessary. Don't leave the percentage sign out here. Last but not least, and I'm going to end, I've gone over time as well, Luigi, is that all throughout your paper, you have to account for 100% of your patients, of your population, of your participants. Don't be like in Scotland, okay? 100% of your patients have to be accounted for. You cannot talk about some without talking about the others. It's ambiguous. It's poor medical style. Okay, I'm going to stop here.
My name is Patricio Cala. I'm from Argentina. I have a question. Most of us do not speak English as our native language, and that reflects on the writing on the paper. What's your opinion on these sites, these ghostwriting sites that have you correct not maybe the methodology, but the language itself?
Very good question. It's a difficult one to answer. Ghostwriters are professional writers that do the work, you give them the data, and they come up with the writing, they come up with the composition. You have to check what has been done. That's the problem. You cannot just accept what a ghostwriter does. A ghostwriter means that it's a writer, he's a ghost, that means his name does not appear as one of the authors. My experience as a critique of that is not good. And let me cite an example of a anti-COX-2 drug that was popularized a couple of years ago that came out from Merck. I can't remember the name. In French, we call it the CPEX. Anti-COX-2 for pain killer. It was published in a JAMA, very illustrious journal, randomized controlled trial showing that it worked. And then it was taken off the market because of cardiac complications that occurred that had not been mentioned in the randomized controlled trial. This went to court. And they found out that the paper was written by a ghostwriter, not a doctor. This ghostwriter, when he looked at the data, he saw the data that there were complications, cardiac complications. So he asked the authors, what should I do about this? Oh, we'll talk about that later. That was a big mistake. That drug works. It has side effects, but it's off the market, and no one's going to talk about it anymore. And Merck had to pay, I don't know how many millions of dollars for that court suit. So ghostwriters, yes, I understand that you need somebody to help you when your English is not your native language. But you have to verify the scientific content once it's been written. That's my message. Any other questions? Thank you for yours. It's very important. Okay, I'm going to continue. I'm going to talk to you now about the structure. We talked about the style. Remember that goldfish going into the glass bowl? The glass bowl is the structure. Once again, medical writing is, I'm repeating my slides explicitly. It's a very special form of communication. We have to be objective, but our goal is to get a message across. And that goal, not necessarily the same as the reader, has to be unambiguous, and we have to be able to communicate as a writer to the reader. And we want to do so to make sure that that container has a structure in order to be easily understood. We want to make sure that the fish is seen through a crystal clear style and structure. Now, why is structure so important? Structure ensures an order. The order in the writing and the order in the reading. It gives us a balance between the chapters. And it makes sure, it's a way of making sure that everything is included. And it guides the reader through the text. They know where they come from, they know where they are, they know where they're headed. And if you want to have a particular information, you know where to go. Now, in medical writing, we have a particular structure that looks like this. We have a title, we have a summary or an abstract. Two words are synonymous today. And then we have what we call the IMRAD structure, which stands for Introduction, Material Methods, Results, and Discussion. It actually comes from Pasteur. Pasteur was the first person that wrote in the 19th century with an introduction, with material methods, results, and discussion in that order, but did not formalize what we call today the IMRAD structure. To that we add references, figures, illustrations in specific chapters. We'll go into that later. Let's take a look at the title. A title should be a maximum of meaning with a minimum of words. It should be enticing, it should be attractive. You should be able to read a title and know exactly what you're going to expect when you read the paper. It's impressive, and it has to be impressive, like the facade of a church. You want to look at the church and go inside. Same thing with the title. You want to read the paper. Once again, two types of titles, like two types of verbs, descriptive or declarative. If you use the present tense, it's very strong. Cancer survival is associated. This means that, it should mean that in this paper, the authors have shown, have demonstrated that there is a relationship, even though it's an associated. Again, some examples. Here, the word as can be used as the verb is. Very strong. It's a declarative title. This one we've seen before. Sorry, repetition. The title should, or the subtitle, should, and or the subtitle, should contain the type of study. If possible, in a comparison, the comparator. If possible, for a population, a word that indicates the type of patients or the population, the disease, and the main result, but only if causality is implied. Otherwise, you don't have to tell the result. This is a very strong title. Population-based studies should not be. This is an order. He's giving you an order. In order to say something like that, he should have proven that by a randomized controlled trial, which is not the case. The length of your title is proportional to the precision that you want to give. We've talked about that before. Remember, precision, clarity, brevity, or concision. There should be a balance between the two. Very short title. Little more precision, little more precision, more precision, and more precision. But as we go toward precision, we lose the brevity. So there has to be a balance between the two according to what you want to relate. Don't go over 10 or 12 words. This is the same title that we saw before, just once again to insist on what we call the strong or the key words or front focus words. These are the most important words of a title, the first words. Here we're talking the essential part of this paper should be about gastric perforation, and as we saw before, the peritoneal dissemination that is the result of that perforation. Here we have a clear title, but it also could have another title. Once again, the strong words are gastric perforation here, risk of peritoneal dissemination here, and endoscopic perforation here. Completely different topics because of the strong words, because of the first words of your title. Do not mention affiliations or attributions in a title. Don't tell people where you're from. There may be an indication for specific titles. For instance, this is related to the population. This is a little bit different. What about a question for a title? Okay, but the answer should be obvious. That's not always the case. Here's a question. Does screening save lives? Okay, it's a systematic review of meta-analyses and randomized controlled trials. I don't know what that means, but that's the way the title is. But you don't know the answer. Even when you read the conclusion, you don't know the answer. Sorry. This is something that's been done in the British Medical Journal, which I find good. There is a question. Should we use large-scale healthcare interventions? But they give the answer. Should oxygen be given? Yes. And they give the reason. This is a very attractive and interesting, enticing title, using a question mark. It's also an excellent method for an editorial. There are exceptions as to using affiliations and attributions when you have an acronym. Does everybody know what the difference between an abbreviation and an acronym is? This is an acronym or an abbreviation, or is it both? Acronym, why? Because you can pronounce it. You can say color. Etc., written ETC, is an abbreviation, but it's not an acronym. You can't say ICT, or you can say it, but no one will understand it, okay? An acronym is an abbreviation that you can pronounce. So, once again, no affiliations. Here we see the VU, University of Medical. This is indicated someplace else. Don't waste those words in your abbreviation, in your abstract, or in your title. There are some exceptions, once again, as I said. Don't use abbreviations in your titles, even if those abbreviations are well known, even if those abbreviations are defined in your text. Now, this is very specific for those that are hepatobiliary surgeons, if there are any. You will understand what that means. But it's also a play on words, because it's coming from Switzerland, and you see the word Alps. That's probably why it got admitted and got accepted. But don't use abbreviations in your title. Try to avoid articles. Don't use the past tense. If you use a verb, it should be in the present tense, and once again, it's strong. Your study title should be mentioned. Here we see randomized clinical trial. Sorry. Here's another one. Study design, a systematic review. A randomized control trial as a subtitle. When you write your title, do you write your title to begin with? When you write a paper, I'm sorry, do you write your title first? How many of you do that? Okay. As you've heard from Professor Talamini, he jots down everything, which is good. You want to have an idea of what you're talking about. But I personally would say, even if you're thinking about a title, don't decide on your title before you've finished everything. I usually write my title, my final title, as the last part of a paper. I like to think about a title. I like to permute, as I just told you about, making the strong words, first words, vary in that title to make sure that once I've finished my paper, that the result or the conclusion comes up in those first words of the title. Okay? So you see that's related to what I've just said. Let's look at the summary now. With the exception of editorials, clinical images, or sometimes case reports, all articles today have a summary or an abstract. A couple of years ago, the word summary was reserved only for written papers, and abstract was for presentations, oral presentations. Nowadays, as I said before, some of the journals even use them interchangeably, and most of us speak about the same thing. It's not very important. The summary is a snapshot of your article. It's like a postcard. When you write a postcard, you can't tell everything that's happened. You just have one little spot. You're limited in space, and abstracts are usually limited in the number of words. So it's a snapshot or a postcard of your paper. Nowadays, most of the abstracts are structured. By structured means that they have chapters, and the journal requires that you use those chapters with those chapter headings in your abstract. They may be elaborate here, like we have 7 items here, or at the least a generic summary, which is based on the IMRAD system, where you have introduction is replaced by objectives, background, or context, material methods, okay, results, okay, no discussion, but a conclusion. The discussion is something specific to the paper, but does not belong in the abstract. Do not forget that a title and an abstract, or title and a summary, go together as a couple, as an entity. And if possible, try to avoid any redundancy in the words that are used in the title and in the abstract. But it should be complete, because many people will look at the title and the summary only before they say or think that they are interested in reading the paper. One of the big problems with summaries is that there is a word limit. That word limit is imposed by the journal. When it's 300 words, you don't have much of a problem. 75 words can be a big problem. And you might take longer to write an abstract with 75 words than to write your paper. But it has to be done. Why does it have to be done? Because it's a limit that is now in the electronic age what we call permissive. In other words, if you put more than 75 words in that little box, you can't go to the next page. So if it says there are journals that require an abstract of 75 words, if you have 76, you can't go to the next page. So you have to find a way of putting two words together and so forth. Anyhow. In the summary, you can use abbreviations, but only if it shortens the amount of words. But if you do, even if that abbreviation has been used in the text, you have to define it the first time used. So you have to calculate if, by defining that abbreviation and using the abbreviation afterwards, you have less words or not. Then you can use it, or you should use it, in your summary. This is essential. The summary of your abstract should correspond exactly to the summary of your text. Now, what happens? As for the title, many people write the abstract and then they go write the paper. But finally, when they write the paper, they've come to a conclusion that they didn't think about when they wrote the summary, and they don't correct the summary. This is very confusing and very ambiguous and poor medical writing. The conclusion in your summary has to be exactly the same as in the core text. What I recommend is not to write the title, not to write the abstract until you've finished your paper. The title, as I said, you brainstorm, you find the permutation of words that you want to make sure that the strong words reflect the main idea or conclusion of your paper. And for the summary, you copy and paste. Take the sentences from your conclusion in the core text, put them into the summary. This is not plagiarism, it's not copying, it's okay, it's perfect, and it's really good. This way you'll never make a mistake. Okay, am I clear about that? Copy and paste. Different conclusions. This is not good writing. Here we have a strong verb, here we have a hedging verb. Who do you believe? Which one should you believe? So once again, wait till the end, copy and paste, start with a detailed, structured format, what you did, what you found, highlight what the readers want, and then write your abstract.